senior researcher with the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg, speaking to you from our Berlin office, where together with my colleagues Maren Filov and Franziska Sterk, I am the Berlin leg of the trilateral Deep Cuts project. The Deep Cuts Commission is a group of experts from the United States, from Russia, and from Germany. The project itself was established more than 8 years ago in 2013, and since then the group has actively participated in arms control debates, particularly on nuclear arms control, by publishing statements, by doing research, and through events, including through briefings like this one. This year we've also added, I'm proud to say, the Young Deep Cuts Commission, a group of 12 exceptional young arms control experts to the project. I'm having a little bit of sound problem here because I'm hearing myself on my headphones, so excuse me for that. The purpose of the project as a whole, the Deep Cuts Commission and the Young Deep Cuts Commission, is to identify opportunities to reduce nuclear weapons through cooperative arms control. And when we began to plan for this seminar, we had been hoping to be able to discuss this with you in person on the sidelines of the NPT review conference in New York. As you know, that review conference has been postponed until August, but as it turns out, we were quite lucky in choosing the date for this event, because we are meeting this evening in the midst of a series of important diplomatic gatherings, which also address arms control options. Last week, Russia, together with the United States, NATO allies, and OSCE members, discussed how arms control may be helpful in diffusing current tensions. Two themes that have emerged are also familiar to the Deep Cuts Commission. One is, after the demise of the INF Treaty, can there be progress on non-strategic nuclear weapons, particularly those deployed in Europe? And the other question that has emerged is, can both sides use confidence building and transparency measures to diffuse current tensions? These issues are sure to come up when US Secretary of State Blinken comes to Europe later this week, hopefully to meet also with his Russian counterpart in Geneva on Friday. The Commission has addressed these and related issues in a statement that we released last December, and which I think some speakers will refer to today. And I would also like to draw your attention to a paper that was published yesterday by the Young Deep Cuts Commission, which contains a number of great ideas on how US-Russian arms control can be revitalized through an integrated approach. All of these publications, as well as analysis on other relevant arms control issues, can be found on our website at deepcuts.org. I'm very happy that we have 4 experts with us today who bring with them a wealth of experience on arms control from different perspectives, and they will discuss with us how we can take arms control forward and what role it might play in diffusing current tensions between NATO and Russia. First up will be Deep Cuts Commission member Angela Kane, who is senior fellow with the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. And Angela, until 2015, was the United Nations High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. Next up will be Daryl Kimball, the Executive Director of the Arms Control Association, which is our American partner in the project. And we also have with us Andrei Zagorski, who is professor at MD University in Moscow, and also head of the Center for International Security at the Primakov Institute of World Economy and International Relations, also known as IMEMO, which is our Russian partner in this project. Their very short input will be followed by a comment from the German government's perspective. I'm very grateful that we have with us Rüdiger Bohn, who is acting commissioner for disarmament and arms control at the German government. I would particularly like to thank him for taking the time after what has been an extraordinarily busy day today with our German foreign minister in Moscow and NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg in Berlin today. And I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank the Foreign Office for their continuous support over the last 8 years for the Deep Cuts project. It's rare that projects such as the Deep Cuts project are continuously funded over such a long time, and we are very grateful for that. Before I give the panelists the floor, very few necessary remarks on the ground rules for the meeting. Today, this is an on-the-record meeting. We are recording it and are live streaming it for the first time ever on YouTube. We'll post the recording on our website after the meeting. For your questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. My colleague Maren will help me screen the questions, and I hope we can put as many of your questions and comments to the speakers after their very brief introductions. With that, enough from me. And again, thanks for joining us, and over to you, Angela, please.
Thank you very much, Oliver, and thank you to Deep Cuts Commission for having me. And it's good to be among good colleagues and good friends as well. Now I'm setting the stage a little bit for the Deep Cuts Commission statement, which sets out, if you have read it, and it's a very important roadmap for progress, and it sets it out in 4 pages. But with the NPT review conference once again postponed, the Deep Cuts Commission statement, which sets out. But now it has become even more crucial to advance on issues that can move forward towards the goal posed not only of a successful review conference, but also a safer world. And it may be true that the risk of large-scale nuclear war has declined, but we're really seeing an increase in geopolitical tensions and also in competition. We're witnessing regional stability increase tremendously over the last few weeks and months, the proliferation of weapons and also the materials to make them. We're also seeing emerging threats like cyber and terrorism. And what this tells us is that the risk of a single nuclear weapon being detonated, whether it's by accident, by miscalculation, or by purpose, is higher than in the past. But it's also true that the arms control architecture, which constituted a strong pillar of strategic stability during the Cold War, has crumbled. Treaties have been abrogated, military strategic cooperation has fallen into disuse, and mistrust really prevails. This assessment has been reflected in the doomsday clock, which for the last 2 years was set as the closest ever been to civilization ending apocalypse. In 2 days, we will see where it will stand in 2022. But the status quo is simply not sustainable, and the consequences of inaction are unacceptable. And this is why the DCC, the Deep Cuts statement, urges both sides to move swiftly and decisively. Let me recall that in her first public statement after assuming her office, US Undersecretary Bonnie Jenkins pointed to the time window provided by the extension of New START, but she also underlined the need to explore future steps, as New START does not cover all of Russia's nuclear weapons. Novel nuclear weapons of intercontinental range are being developed, she stated, and hybrid tactics substantially increased the risk of miscalculation and also of escalation. Now, the Deep Cuts Commission statement outlined 4 issues. 1, further reducing strategic arsenals. 2, extending arms control to include tactical nuclear weapons. 3, averting a race in intermediate range missiles. And 4, limiting strategic missile interceptors. Focusing on these proposals would be essential to maintain US-Russian strategic stability and avert unconstrained, costly, and also dangerous nuclear weapon competition. But the DCC statement also points out that the focus needs to be broadened and that must include China. All 3 states have expressed support for arms control, but China has never participated in arms reduction negotiations and has rejected doing so until the number of US-Russian weapons decreases to her level, clearly putting up a barrier to engagement that is impossible to attain in the foreseeable future. One way to circumvent this argument is to broaden the dialogue and to include France and the UK as well. And why not? One destabilizing factor is China's steady expansion of its nuclear arsenal without the indication of an upper ceiling. Yet a first step could be, as suggested in the DCC statement, to focus on nuclear risk reduction. Another issue is the UK's review of security policy, which was issued last year, which increased the nuclear stockpile and would not disclose the conditions under which they would be used, thus committing to a strategy of nuclear ambiguity. This undermines efforts to promote transparency. In light of the US decision in November to publicly release the total number of nuclear weapons in the US stockpile, is it possible for others to follow suit? This would constitute a really important confidence-building measure. I would like to mention a few additional points for consideration. First, the risk of crisis instability is being exacerbated by the growing entanglement between the nuclear and the non-nuclear domains, especially with conventional weapons, which are becoming increasingly powerful due to cyber capabilities, new strategic nuclear delivery systems announced by President Putin in 2018 already, as well as cruise missiles and hypersonic boost glide missiles. Second, the US is working on a nuclear posture review, which is expected in the spring. Will President Biden follow through on his position as a presidential candidate to, quote, work to maintain a strong, credible deterrent while reducing our reliance and excessive expenditure on nuclear weapons, unquote? In the fraught internal US political atmosphere, can he afford to do so? And third, according to Russia, NATO's eastward expansion has undermined security in the region, while the US led the charge in raising alarm over Russian troop movements near Ukraine. In Finland, the debate has been reignited to consider joining NATO. And while this may not happen immediately, the fact that it is being discussed publicly has already stirred anger in the Russian Federation. Fourth, and following on the previous point, the European security structure has crumbled. The observation that Europe should sit at the table during bilateral Russian-US negotiations has been made by several analysts, and I agree. Europe should not be a bystander, but it is equally important that both the US and Russia realize that only a multilateral process can be successful. Fifth, the JCPOA negotiations are ongoing. How will their outcome influence the discussions on arms control and strategic stability? Sixth, the DCC statement makes suggestions for Europe's role in reducing nuclear dangers. These are important, but let us not forget that not all European countries are NATO allies. And finally, the political landscape is changing in Europe. Germany's September election has brought a new government, one that continues to commit to NATO and the stationing of nuclear weapons on her territory, but at the same time wants to see, quote, a world without nuclear weapons, a world that is more secure, unquote, in the words of Foreign Minister Baerbock in December. And the station, coupled with the increasingly vocal opposition of young people to nuclear weapons, may in the future pose a challenge to the decades-old arms control structures which were established decades ago. Thank you. Vocal in opposition of young people.
Thank you very much, Angela. And over to you, Daryl.
The decades-old arms control structures.
Well, thank you very much, Oliver, and to the team with the Deep Cuts Commission project. It's a pleasure to be with you here, speaking to you from Washington, D.C. As Angela said in her opening, there is a broad range of challenging issues that are now before US and Russian leaders that have to be addressed. And one of my central messages, and I think that of the Commission, is that it is in the interest of the United States and Russia and Europe and the international community that progress on new nuclear arms control arrangements do not fall victim to the deep and perhaps irreconcilable differences over NATO's relationship with Russia, the delays in the implementation of the Minsk II agreement, which was from 2015, which was, of course, designed to avoid further conflict over Ukraine. And I would just note that with respect to the United States and Russian nuclear arms control agenda, the clock is ticking. It has been nearly a year since President Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin extended the last remaining treaty limiting their massive strategic nuclear arsenals, the 2010 New Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. It has been more than 6 months since the two presidents met in Geneva and agreed to restart the strategic stability dialogue to, quote, lay a groundwork for future arms control and risk reduction measures, unquote. But since then, in my view, and I think the view of the Commission, too little has been achieved to negotiate a new agreement or agreements before the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty expires on February 5, 2026. And if we look at the political calendar, especially here in the United States, and consider that President Biden may only have one term, progress in 2022, 2023, and US election year 2024 is important. And the United States and Russia have a difficult but resolvable set of issues to deal with regarding the next round of strategic arms control. Now, Russia's decision to inject additional demands regarding security guarantees into the strategic security dialogue may be understandable because these reflect some of Russia's longstanding and in many cases legitimate concerns, but it has also complicated the nuclear arms control negotiating equation. And as Angela pointed out in her opening, and as we point out in our Deep Cuts Commission statement, there are essentially 4 sets of nuclear arms control issues that the two sides must and can move quickly on to find effective solutions for. And these relate to the task of further reductions in their strategic nuclear arsenals, tackling the tactical nuclear weapons problem, which has never been part of any formal US-Russian, US-Soviet nuclear arms control arrangement, limiting strategic interceptors, long a concern of Russia, has been the United States slowly but ever expanding capabilities with respect to strategic ballistic missile interceptors that can affect Russia's offensive retaliatory potential, and averting an arms race on intermediate range missiles, especially in the wake of the INF treaty debacle over the past couple of years, in which both countries have withdrawn from that 1987 treaty. Now, I would note that following the last round of the strategic stability dialogue on January 10th, Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman, who is the point person for the United States, noted correctly that, quote, these kinds of arms control negotiations, as President Putin himself has said, don't happen in just a day or even a week. They're generally quite complex, very technical, and take some time. But we certainly are ready to move expeditiously as one possibly can in these circumstances, unquote. So it's going to be very important that as Secretary Blinken and Minister Lavrov meet again next week, that they continue the dialogue on the issues that Russia has injected into the discussion on Russia's concerns about the future of NATO, force deployments, conventional force deployments, and the common NATO-Russia frontier. But it's also going to be important that the two sides maintain their focus in these what are now discussions about arms control and quickly move to make them negotiations. And so I wanted to focus very quickly on one particular issue that Russia has put on the table that is part of this 4-point nuclear arms control framework that the two sides are striving to try to address. And that is Russia's proposal in Article 6 of its draft treaty that was put forward on December 17th regarding intermediate range missile restriction options. Russia has called for legally binding assurances regarding the deployment of missiles formerly banned by the INF treaty. And Russia's proposal, in my view, requires further work, but it requires and deserves a constructive counterproposal from the United States in consultation with NATO. And I would just note that what Russia has proposed, and this is a variation on something that President Putin outlined more than a year ago, is that the parties, that is the United States and Russia, shall undertake not to deploy ground-launched intermediate range and shorter range missiles outside their national territories, as well as in areas of their national territories from which such weapons can attack targets in the national territory of the other party. So Russia has noted previously that this proposal would take into account the 9 M729 ground-launched cruise missile, which the United States and NATO considered to be a violation of the original INF treaty. And Russia has said that they would be interested in negotiating verification arrangements around this general concept. So there's a lot more that needs to be dealt with in the context of this very basic proposal from Russia. Those issues, plus the question of Russia's Iskander missiles, conventionally armed, that are based in Kaliningrad, as well as the United States Mark 41 launchers in Poland and Romania that are designed right now to hold SM-3 Block 2A missile interceptors, which are not offensive weapons, but Russia says they're concerned that these Mark 41 launchers could in the future carry offensive missiles. So these are all the kinds of issues that the two sides need to discuss in earnest. And if Russia is interested, Russia is going to have to provide the negotiators with the time and the space to explore these issues. And I hope that Foreign Minister Lavrov and Blinken agree that there is a reason to continue with the diplomatic track after they meet later this week. And I would just note quickly that other options for dealing with the intermediate range missile issue might include agreeing on a verifiable ban on all nuclear armed ground launched and sea launched cruise missiles and ballistic missiles of intermediate range, 500 kilometers to 5,500 kilometers, or even a prohibition on ground launched ballistic missiles of intermediate range, very similar to the original INF treaty. So there are other variations. The United States and NATO have not yet formally responded. I think it would be important for them to do so. There are other issues we can talk about in the discussion regarding approaches on missile defense, strategic nuclear weapons, and as Angela said, some of the new missile technologies, including hypersonic weapons that Russia has begun to deploy, the United States has begun to develop. But I will stop there and just underscore the view that this agenda, which is very important for both sides, cannot be lost in the broader discussion that has now erupted over Ukraine, over the decades-old issue of NATO expansion. And that from the US perspective, as President Biden noted back in June, throughout the long history of competition between the United States and Russia, the two countries have been able to find ways to manage tensions and to keep them from escalating out of control. And in our view, in my view, that is essential, and failure is not an option. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daryl. And let me just note that Secretary General Stoltenberg, during his visit today in Berlin, did again say that NATO is ready to engage on reciprocal and verifiable arms control in principle. So basically has taken on the US position as you outlined it. But let's move to Andrei with a view from Moscow, where it is already rather late. So thanks for taking the time so late in the evening to discuss the state of affairs with us. And over to you, Andrei.
Thank you, Oliver. And both Angela and Daryl have already presented the main 4 areas of focus in the most recent Deep Cuts statement. I'm not going to repeat this. Let me add and highlight a few points in addition to this. So we pick up the 4 areas because they all are within the strategic dialogue between Russia and the US, although the diplomats have yet to figure out how they structure this, on which avenues they want to advance in which way. But these are the 4 areas which represent either the long existing gaps in arms control architecture, such as non-strategic nuclear weapons, or the gaps which have occurred more recently, like the INF range weapons, or the gaps which may occur in the future. And this will be a near future, as Daryl has also highlighted this, because we don't have much time to negotiate a new agreement to replace the New START. So these are the most important gaps which need to be addressed primarily bilaterally by US and Russia, but also with some kind of participation and input from the other nations. I would not exclude even from China, which is not yet part of the whole development. So this is to say we have identified the 4 main areas in which we see the need in the progress. Of course, in each of those areas, in some more, in some less, there is a great variety of options of particular solutions which need to be negotiated on specific issues. And we also do have, I wouldn't say differences, but we have the representation of this variety of thinking about how specific issues can be fixed. And this is something which we will have to address in the future. This is something which the diplomats will have to address future. Let me, at this point, only stress that the purpose of the Deep Cuts Commission is exactly to help the governments of our countries to identify solutions. They may take them up or not, it's at their discretion, but this is a venue for dialogue on discussing what options are available for addressing those issues which are on the table. My third and last point would be, just saving time for the discussion, for the questions and answers, would be to caution that we should not fear huge effect from the more recent turn in the discussions within the strategic dialogue format, which was last week, addressing the most recent Russian proposals for the security guarantees. For 2 reasons. The strategic dialogue, it was good to have it because it was a place where one could put the issues on the table. And that was a ready table which could kickstart the discussions on those issues. I'm sure that there will be no mixture and no replacement by the strategic dialogue agenda by the new discussion which is evolving so far on the European security. We have yet to identify appropriate platforms for discussing various issues which are put on the table. It was good to kickstart again this discussion, but it's not going to replace the strategic dialogue as it has been started after the Biden-Putin meeting. Of course, the progress or failure of the discussion of the European security issues may either have negative impact on strategic dialogue, although I believe both the US and Russia are still anyway committed to maintaining strategic stability. I cannot imagine anything which would skip this from the agenda of the US-Russian talks. It may complicate discussions on other issues in the basket of this. But if we do see progress, and I hope we do, I'm so far hearing, despite of the over-dramatizing on both sides of the issues, I see some promising developments. Both sides have highlighted the red lines they see. We know about it, and once we have the response from the US and NATO, once we have, if you wish, a counter proposal, we'll better see where we can go. And this can even boost the strategic dialogue because it could add an important other dimension, which was never exactly in the focus of the Deep Cuts Commission, the conventional arms control. We did stuff on these issues, but the Deep Cuts was mostly devoted to discussing nuclear disarmament. But of course, adding a conventional arms control dimension to the not just US, Russia, but Russia, NATO plus talks would be important because most recent studies have clearly identified the risks of nuclear escalation, which emanate from conventional escalation in Europe. And this definitely fits into the strategic stability debate. This will not be the focus of the strategic stability dialogue, but this could complement the whole discussion. And this will be a very important dimension. Let me stop here, and I'm looking forward to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrei. That was very succinct. Before I give the floor to Rüdiger Bohn, let me remind you that we'd like to encourage you, invite you to put your questions and comments into the Q&A section. You should see the bottom of your screen so that we can jump into the Q&A right after Rüdiger Bohn's input. And I'm looking forward to your comments on where Germany would like to see discussions on arms control, particularly nuclear arms control, go over the next couple of weeks and months. Thanks.
Thank you, Oliver. Thank you for having me at this panel. And of course, we appreciate and support the work of the Deep Cuts Commission. I welcome very much that in the midst of the standstill in nuclear disarmament and arms control and the current political tensions, the Deep Cuts Commission in its unique trilateral format presents concrete proposals on the future of arms control and disarmament. And its mission, quote, to address key challenges to significantly lowering nuclear weapons arsenals, unquote, remains very relevant. The topic we want to discuss today has become part of a broader discussion on security in the European theater as the current tensions around Ukraine and Russia's military posture in the vicinity and the Moscow's demands for security guarantees and so on are a matter of increasing concern. And in this context, the recent US-Russian strategic stability dialogue has become part of a series of important meetings last week, including the NATO-Russia Council and the meeting of the Permanent Council of the OSCE. We think it was extremely important to have these three meetings in order to open a diplomatic path to the current broader discussions on the European security structure. And we are fully committed to supporting a meaningful and reciprocal dialogue. It goes without saying that in order to succeed, this dialogue needs to be based on the core principles of European security as agreed inter alia in the Helsinki Final Act, the Paris Charter, or the NATO-Russia Founding Act. And it needs to take into account the security interests of all states in the Euro-Atlantic area. Although the situation we are in is far from easy or promising, we see at least a small window for a more constructive dialogue on topics such as channels of communications, risk reduction, transparency, confidence building measures and disarmament, arms control in the framework of possible further talks between Russia and the US and NATO respectively. But at the same time, it is essential that the US and Russia continue their strategic stability talks in the SSD framework, despite the political tensions, or rather because of the tensions in Putin's proposals. Possessing 90% of all nuclear weapons, both countries bear a special responsibility. We hope that the US-Russian strategic stability dialogue will continue to lay the groundwork for future nuclear arms control arrangements. Both sides need to address a broad range of complex issues, such as strategic and non-strategic nuclear weapons, conventional precision strike weapons, outer space security, and I guess missile defense. So let me briefly point out 5 German expectations, which correspond, by the way, very much with the Deep Cuts Commission statement. My first point is we think we need further reduction of arsenals. We see potentials for further reductions in the US and Russian strategic weapons arsenals in the framework of a follow-on New START treaty. Back in 2013, then President Obama proposed an additional 1/3 reduction of strategic nuclear weapons. This idea could be further explored. Secondly, we think we need to broaden the scope of arms control. We need to capture all, especially Russian nuclear systems, not just the strategic ones. This is important for Europeans. And we are particularly concerned, as you know, about the massive qualitative and quantitative disparity in non-strategic nuclear arsenals in favor of Russia. We need to capture these short and intermediate range systems in future arms control arrangements, particularly after the loss of the INF Treaty. The last point remains a challenge. In the 1980s, when the INF Treaty was negotiated, it became clear that it is difficult to verify the payload, the ranges of missiles, including the geographic location of mobile launchers. As a result, the INF banned a whole category of missiles without differentiation. The challenge of how a post-INF arrangement could look like is still there, and it is growing as missiles and other unmanned delivery systems become increasingly important in many parts of the world. One word on conventional arms control. The conventional arms control architecture in Europe has been constantly eroding over the past years for geostrategic and technological reasons. New thinking is needed also with a view to the increasing entanglement with the nuclear domain, which was mentioned also by others here. And the same is true for new technologies and new security domains. we need new arms control approaches. The current debates already show some of these approaches will be based on regulation of responsible behavior, moving away from object-based regimes to behavior-based arrangements. This is clearly seen now in the debates on space security, cybersecurity, and lethal autonomous weapon systems. Yeah, regarding China, China is building up its nuclear arsenal and investing in new technologies and domains. In our increasingly multipolar world, it is important that China assumes more responsibility in the field of CSBM's transparency and arms control and disarmament. And this finger pointing at China can only work if the US and Russia move forward. In this regard, we welcome very much the recent P5 statement reaffirming that the nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. There was first an agreement on this formula by the US and Russia bilaterally, and then this formula was joined by China and then the others of the P5. So a dialogue and cooperation among the P5 remains key for reducing tensions and risk of escalation. But at the same time, we need more concrete steps towards nuclear disarmament to strengthen and maybe revitalize the NPT process. So in conclusion, I would say that the US-Russian strategic stability dialogue can give nuclear arms control and disarmament a new impetus. And for us, the Europeans, it is especially important that we have a say, because also our European security is at stake here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all four speakers for their inputs. The first questions are coming in. We have a good 20 minutes to take your questions and comments. And let me start by asking a question that Ute Fink-Kremer, the former member of parliament and chair of the subcommittee on arms control here in Germany, puts forward. And this is on conventional arms control, an issue that came up already. I think Andrei and Rüdiger mentioned it already. And Ute Fink-Kremer asked, could there be a role for the Open Skies Treaty as a confidence building measure, not as formal return of Russia and the United States as parties to the treaty, but maybe by voluntary inspection flights on a mutual basis following the protocol of the treaty and using certified platforms. The Open Skies Treaty still formally exists, but of course, after the departure of the United States and Russia is kind of in limbo, if I can call it that. So how does that, are there ways to imagine that we can use this instrument? I think it was the US side that actually highlighted after the Geneva talks last Monday, the importance of also addressing transparency, confidence building. I'm looking at you a little bit, Andrei, here on the screen, because you raised conventional arms control, whether you would like to come in on how this could be done, or if anybody else would like to come in, indicate that to me, conventional arms control, open skies, can we save it? Can we revise it, revitalize it? Daryl is raising his hand.
I think Andrei was ready to go. I have an additional point.
Apologies, I didn't quite see that. So Andrei, why don't you go first?
Okay, thank you. I could give the floor to Daryl as well. I have no definite answer to the question on open skies. I would not exclude this opportunity. First of all, very much would depend on the details of the amount of flights, geography of flights. It would very much depend on whether or not the US would be ready to reopen areas for all flights, but not only US. So one should look, it could be explored, but I don't have yet any definite answer. And my second part of the answer would be to say, very much would depend on the general package of where we move on conventional arms control. I cannot imagine that we could achieve a progress on one track without having progress on other tracks for conventional arms control and transparency as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrei. Daryl, you wanted to add?
Well, I agree with Andrei that the Open Skies Treaty has been a very important confidence building mechanism. I think that the reality is that unless the United States and Russia are both actively participating, it's going to be difficult to sustain that as a mechanism over time. it's currently, it does not seem to be a high priority for either country, unfortunately. I would just note that there are other measures that could and should be discussed that would reduce tensions along the risk of accident and incidents along the common NATO-Russia frontier. We addressed a lot of these issues in the 2016 report of the Deep Cuts Commission, and these have come up again in the last couple of weeks regarding measures that might lead to a scaling back of Russian and NATO military exercises that each side considers to be provocative. Also, maneuvers and overflights that can lead to military encounters that could potentially lead to an accident, a shooting by a pilot or somebody on the ground that escalates. So, this should be another area where the United States and Russia, in coordination with NATO, try to redouble efforts because this could reduce tensions that have been there since before the current flare-up over Ukraine. Russia's apparent military buildup along the Ukrainian border, and this most recent exchange. But those kinds of discussions will take time, and I think it's important that leaders in Moscow and Washington and Europe understand that there are not going to be quick solutions in any of these conventional arms control or risk reduction areas, but they can make progress if there is the will and there are creative approaches.
Thank you, Daryl. Angela, you also wanted to come in on this point.
I just wanted to come in on something, and I think it was Andrei who first also talked about it's good that the strategic stability dialogue is taking place simply because the proposals are on the table, the red lines have been drawn, so we know where we are. I wanted to basically think that the word confidence building measures, I think, is really the one that is the underlying operative principle here. And I think that's extremely important. And I thank Ute for bringing that up. But what I do worry about is that right now we here have the principles. I mean, we have basically Wendy Sherman, we have Ryabkov on the other side. But where is the team that is working on all of this? Because I think that right now it's too charged to the extent that, yes, I mean, the proposals on the table, red lines are drawn, but then there has to be another process. And where are the teams that are working on this? Because ultimately, I think there have to be various groups that need to work on these issues, that need to look in detail at these issues and then bring them together. And I worry a little bit that maybe the teams, are they, it's a little bit intransparent, if I can call it that. Are they in place? Are they working strongly? But I do sense, and that is the good part of it, that there's a strong will to actually not put things on the table's sake, but rather to make progress. And I think that is something that comes through in the comments that are being made. And that is very positive, particularly in this day and age when there are so many other issues, like the Ukraine issue, etc., that is coming and resurfacing and basically dominating the discussion.
Thank you very much. There are a set of questions on the structure and scope of a possible New START follow-on agreement or agreements. And let me try to bundle them together with us, because I think they all go in a similar direction. There's Oliver Guest, who asks whether negotiators should aim to impose limits on a particular type of strategic delivery system, or whether this principle of freedom to mix that we have under the New START Treaty should be maintained. And Noah Mayu, a member of the Young Deep Cuts Commission and associate of the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, asked about the Russian proposal on INF-type missiles. And Daryl mentioned here a counter-proposal. What do the speakers think, he asks? What could a counter-proposal entail, and what proposals would you have to mitigate the verification problem that plagued the INF Treaty? And Victoria Newman asked whether including conventional and nuclear weapons, and I presume she also means delivery systems here, dual capable delivery systems in the same treaties, increase the risks of being violated. So basically, they all ask, how specific should future agreements be? Should we aim for a larger set of issues to be addressed in a single treaty, or should we try to break issues down? Something we discussed in the Deep Cuts Commission also. Yeah, any of the three specific aspects that you might want to tackle, I'm happy. Anybody who wants to go first? I'm looking at my screen here and see Rüdiger Bohn, please.
Yeah, maybe very briefly on the latest Russian proposal on INF. I mean, I'm speaking here more on a personal basis because these proposals have to be studied and discussed also within other frameworks. But my observation is that, and Daryl Kimball already pointed to it, that there was an earlier proposal by President Putin that I would call the moratorium proposal, which would have meant that no changes to the current situation would be possible, that the Russians would keep their systems in place and the Europeans would not allow to deploy anything in the European theater. So this was kind of a freeze proposal, and the new proposal is slightly different. This is about creating a situation where one side cannot or should have systems that cannot reach the respective other side, which is different because that would mean that also the Russians would have to withdraw some of their systems out of reach, so to speak. It's interesting to discuss these proposals and also to see how seriously these proposals were meant. But apparently the future of the INF or post-INF arrangements will stay on the agenda. And hopefully there will be the solution to this problem, which is then the solution to the problem of the non-strategic weapons, as I see it at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Andrei, you also have your hand raised.
Thank you. Not all the questions are in the Q&A now. Well, let me recall a few of them. Well, first of all, I don't have yet any indication in the Russian debate on what would be the preference on the side of Russia to have sub-ceilings for different categories of strategic weapons or have the free mix. Well, we have been fairly okay with the free mix we had under the New START. If we identify and agree on any challenges to strategic stability, which may require us some differentiation, we may discuss it, but I don't see yet any strong push in this direction. Secondly, of course, having one treaty which deals with both conventional nuclear weapons is not on the mood of any one of the negotiators. And as I understand, the dialogue which goes on does not exclude any option of having one treaty on nuclear weapons or having several documents, having documents or instruments of different type of commitments, political, legal, etc., well understanding the difficulties of getting stuff ratified. And here we come exactly also on INF and other issues to the nitty-gritties of the specific issues and a variety of options. On INF range, if we would include INF range nuclear on the nuclear disarmament treaty or nuclear reductions treaty in general, this would be one story. If we want a separate instrument on this would be another story. We may differentiate between nuclear capable and non-nuclear weaponized INF range systems and treating the nuclear ones in a nuclear basket and treating the non-nuclear ones in a different basket. We have at least two basic options on proceeding with the limitations, reductions, or liquidation of the respective missiles. We may reduce the missiles by missiles themselves, by the delivery vehicles, or we may address in an agreement the warheads. And this would be a very different story. Warheads deployed, would this include non-deployed warheads, etc.? So there's a range of possibilities. We are not yet that far in discussing this, nuances. This will be all on the table once we agree on the general structure of negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anybody else?
Yeah, Oliver.
Yeah.
So Andrei just pointed out that there are a range of options. Let me just offer some opinions about that issue and a couple of observations. And as I said in my opening remarks, we have to remember that time is short. These negotiations between the United States and the Soviet Union and Russia on nuclear arms control are tedious. They take time. Verification arrangements are difficult to hammer out. The two sides have not begun negotiating yet. They're still on a discussions phase. So all of this tells me that if we want to achieve arrangements, agreements, treaties of some kind before the end of 2025, which I think we need to think of as the effective deadline, a simpler approach is going to be better than a more complex, highly integrated approach. And both countries, diplomats from both countries have noticeably said that they understand that the two sides are working towards an agreement or agreements, plural. And Russia has acknowledged, even more so the United States, that these might take the form of executive agreements that don't have to be ratified by our very sometimes troublesome United States Senate, which requires 67 votes to approve a treaty, or they could be through reciprocal unilateral measures. So what I'm getting to is that I think we need to look at these four sets of issues as interrelated but independently negotiated sets of issues. I think it is highly unlikely that there's going to be a grand new treaty that allows each country, let's say, no more than 1,000 nuclear weapons of any particular type. That's just too complicated for each side to fathom at this stage. I think what we're talking about is a follow-on to New START that has a very similar structure, a very similar counting arrangement that ideally lowers the ceilings. As Rüdiger Bohn said, the United States it considers it unnecessary to maintain 1,550 deployed strategic warheads. We can go lower. I believe Russia can go lower too, and still maintain deterrence against nuclear attack. Tactical nuclear weapons are going to be very difficult. I think it can and should start with an exchange of information about stockpiles that could be backed up with some limited verification and reporting by each side. And that's just to get a baseline of what each side has, where it generally is, et cetera. I've discussed some options on INF range missiles. I agree, Rüdiger, that the Russian proposal in this new draft is a little different. I think it provides a better basis for negotiations because it's more balanced than the previous Russian proposals. But it's interesting that Russia has put a priority on this, and I think that the U.S. and NATO should take that seriously and pursue this with a better proposal or proposals. Missile defense, I mentioned in my list, it's not something the United States necessarily wants to talk about, but I think it is something the United States will have to deal with if we're going to achieve cuts in both sides' tactical and strategic stockpiles. One approach that would avoid a legally binding limit, a new anti-ballistic missile treaty, would be for each side to report to the other on their plans over the next, let's say, 5 years regarding missile defense deployments, so that each side has confidence about what the other is or is not doing. And so long as each side continues to pursue that path and perhaps report on an annual basis, each side will have some confidence about what they can expect and not expect with respect to strategic interceptors, and make a much more reasoned judgment rather than a worst case scenario judgment about what the other is doing or can do moving forward. So that's my take on some of this, with some more particular views about how the two sides might handle these issues in an efficient manner. But again, as I said, I think it's very important that in 2022, the two sides move from a general dialogue and develop actual proposals that they can begin to negotiate.
Thank you, Daryl. Just to quickly add to that, there's a great paper on missile defense and missile defense options that was written recently for the Deep Cuts Commission by Steve Pfeiffer, Andrei Baklitsky, and James Cameron, which you can find on our website. I encourage you to look that up. There's a number of very specific proposals in it on non-strategic nuclear weapons. This issue has come up, of course, 10, 12 years ago already. And I recall that at the time, for example, Germany, together with, I think, Norway, Poland, and a couple of other NATO countries, actually had a specific proposal on the table on transparency notifications for movals of tactical nuclear weapons and others. So there is material to go back to, and we have a history of discussing these issues previously. With that, we're running up to the full hour that we had for this seminar. As a final round of discussion, I'd like to put to all our speakers here a question that Carlo Trezza has posed, which is really one of the big questions that is, I think, on many people's mind, and that has been addressed by you throughout the seminar, but maybe to get a final take on that, particularly today with the meetings that we were having today. And Carlo asks, can these disarmament negotiations be isolated from the Ukraine crisis? Should not risk reduction and confidence building measures be today's priority? Probably, he means instead of pursuing in the first instance full arms control agreements, should we shift priorities would be my take on that questions, or is this not exclusive? Maybe with the, asking you for a short response on this big question before we close the seminar. Maybe we can go in the same order that we began when we started out with Angela, if you can give us your take on Carlo's question.
I think it's a very pertinent question that Carlo is asking. Can it be done? I would put it differently, and I said it must be done. It must be ring fenced. Ukraine crisis gets a lot of eyeballs. I mean, media is all over it. You have a lot of activity, of diplomatic activity. I mean, you mentioned yourself, Stoltenberg was in Berlin today. German Foreign Minister Baerbock is in Moscow. There are other high-ranking US officials also who are traveling to various places. But I think that if you allow this to now disrupt the strategic stability dialogue discussions that are going on, how are you going to find back to it? I think it must be ring-fenced. It must be kept separate. And basically, those strategic stability dialogue must go on with all of the proposals, with all of the considerations, and not only go on, but also intensify. I feel very strongly that it must be ring-fenced, that it should not be disrupted by the Ukraine discussions, by the Ukraine crisis that is going on right now. And I hope that that will remain. So that is basically where I come out on this particular question that Carlo is posing. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Angela. Daryl, did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I agree with Angela. I would add that, if there is some progress between US and Russian negotiators in the strategic security dialogue as it relates to nuclear and missile matters, it can build momentum in other areas of the US, Russia, NATO, Russia dialogue. We've seen that in through the history of East-West relations. And I would also just note, and I say this with a heavy heart, in 2013, Rüdiger Bohn mentioned it, Barack Obama made the proposal for further negotiations with Russia on deeper strategic reductions. That effort was derailed in part because of the previous crisis over Ukraine and Russia's annexation of Crimea. I think, if the situation in Eastern Ukraine right now turns in the wrong direction towards greater conflict, that will, of course, be tragic for a lot of reasons, but one of the many casualties of that would be progress on nuclear arms control. I think that would be inevitable, even if it's Angela's wish and my wish that these issues be kept separate.
Thanks. Andrei.
Let me integrate what Angela and what Daryl have just said. Probably this process cannot be fully isolated from what's going on elsewhere, but at least so far it has been separated from the developments in Ukraine. And this is actually what the Deep Cuts Commission was calling for a long time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Herr Bohn.
Yeah, I mean, if there is a robust crisis about Ukraine, military incursion in Ukraine whatsoever, then I cannot see that we will have business as usual afterwards. In 2014, it was the same situation. Then after the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula, there were formats closed, cooperation was terminated. So this will, of course, then create also obstacles, I guess, for the strategic stability talks between the US and Russia. On the other hand, if we look further back in history, the Cuban Missile Crisis was also kind of a catalyzer for more CSBMs and later then arms control. So a crisis can also become a catalyzer for arms control. And currently, I still hope that we can avoid a major crisis and that in the framework of these diplomatic pathways that we are now opening, that there is a small window opening for a more constructive discussion on CSBMs and arms control. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Those are very good concluding remarks that arms control is not only, I think, a dependent variable of political relations, but it can also help to improve political relations, can be a way to build confidence, as you have said. So I thank you all for joining us this evening, at least evening here in Berlin and certainly in Moscow. Thanks to our speakers for taking the time after what was a very busy and exciting day on these issues that we discussed. I encourage you to keep in touch, to visit our website, deepcuts.org, to follow us on Twitter, to follow the Young Deep Cuts Commission, follow the work they are doing. There's another paper coming out next week on cyber and arms control, very, very, very good paper that I encourage you to look up. With that, I wish you all the best. Stay well, stay safe, and I look forward to being in touch soon. And good evening to you all. Thank you.